Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third of the UKRI's monthly Research Integrity webinars. This month on looking at the recent report by UK Research and Innovation, Research Integrity a Landscape Study. This is a report that was carried out by Vitae, the UK Research Integrity Office, and the UK Reproducibility Network. And today we've got speakers from all those organisations talking about the report, its methodology, its findings, what it means for the research community, and how the UK Research and Innovation and other organisations will be taking the report into account in the next steps. Now we've got over 500 people booked to join us today, and we're just going to wait a few moments while all those attendees come in. We've got over 230 people in the room with us at the moment, which is a somewhat surreal experience for myself and the other speakers because we can only see each other. We can't see you guys, but rest assured we're very glad you joined us today, and we're looking forward for a very exciting and interactive session. Now I'll begin by giving an overview of the day, make a few housekeeping announcements, and then I'll hand over to our first set of speakers. So we're very lucky with our speakers today. We have Dr. Janet Wisely and Dr. Katie Wheat of Vitae, who will be discussing how the study was carried out and talk about its findings. Then Dr. Karen Salt from UK Research and Innovation will discuss UKRI's work on research integrity, why it commissioned this study, and what are the next steps, what happens next within UKRI in response to this study. Dr. Helen Mann, who is the interim chair of the Research Integrity Committee, which sits within UKRI at the moment, will talk about how that organisation is going to be set up and start carrying out its very valuable work. And our final speaker, Dr. Munafo, will talk about the work of the UK Reproducibility Network on research integrity and its involvement in this report. Well, then at 3:20, as you can see from the programme on display, the speakers, joined by Rebecca Veitch, Head of Research Integrity at UK Research and Innovation, will have a panel discussion. We'll take questions from the audience. Now, talking about those questions, if you look at your Zoom toolbar, you will have, in addition to the normal buttons you see in the Zoom meeting, you will see a Q&A button. If you can submit your questions there, please, and you don't have to wait until the panel discussion at 3:20. Submit your questions throughout the session. We'll be keeping an eye on them, and we will make sure those questions are forwarded to the speakers at the end. Now, just to remind you, as a Zoom webinar, all attendees have their microphones and videos muted. So we can't see you or hear you. So you don't have to sit still for 2 hours. That's the good news. But the only way we can hear your questions is through the Q&A function. If you can stick your questions in the Q&A function via the chat function, that would be great. The webinar is being recorded, and the edited recording will be made available afterwards, as will the slides. Also, if you have questions about or need advice in relation to a particular research project, particular research publication, or problems or allegations of research misconduct, this isn't really an appropriate forum to deal with those. We can't give you the dedicated support that you need. So if you have any questions of that sort, please could you submit them to via the UKRI website. There's a reporting form, and we can get in touch with you and give you the support that you need. So that's enough housekeeping announcements from me. I'm just about to introduce the next speakers, but I wanted to talk very briefly about the value of this report. I think studies into research culture are incredibly important because that culture, whether we realise it or not, permeates us and shapes our work and our interactions with the research community in terms of our career tracks. And that culture can safeguard and enhance the quality of research, or it can harm it. And this report is very valuable as it adds to our body of knowledge on what incentives can do to the shape of research and the shape of research careers. Are we promoting good practice, or inadvertently tampering down on good practice and harming research quality, equality of participation and the like? These are very important questions to answer, I think, because in terms of ensuring good quality and ethical research, A compliance approach takes you only so far. Training and leadership, I feel, take you a little further, but again, only so far. Culture and leadership, positive culture and leadership, are very important. So I'll step back now. I'd like to hand you over to our first speakers, Dr. Janet Metcalfe, Head of Vitae, and Dr. Katie Week, Head of Engagement and Policy of Vitae. Doctors, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, James. So I'm Janet Metcalfe, I'm Head of Vitae. And if you're not familiar with Vitae, we are an organisation that supports the career and professional development of researchers. We were the lead organisation on this project, and thank you very much for joining the webinar. We're going to go through how we went about the report and the results coming out of it, and then, as James said, we should have plenty of time to take your questions and hear about your opinions of what's coming out of the report and what should we as a community be doing in terms of supporting research integrity and improving the research culture that we all work within. So the background to this project is a House of Commons Science and Technology Committee report that came out in 2018 that looked at research integrity. And generally what came through that report was that the vast majority of research is of high quality and high levels of research integrity, but acknowledging that problems can occur. This could be either through lack of understanding about research integrity, through errors, genuine errors, through poor research methods, or in extreme cases through deliberate misconduct. They came out with a whole series of recommendations in their report, one of which was to charge UKRI with commissioning research into understanding the effects of the incentives and drivers within the research system in terms of how they impact on researcher behaviours and organisational behaviours in terms of research culture. So we were lucky enough to be commissioned to do this report, and the objectives were to look at those incentives and drivers and look at how they impact on research integrity, taking it in 3 steps really. The first one was to look at, well, what do we know already? What is the existing evidence we have in terms of levels of research integrity? What else do we need to gather? So the second part of the project was looking at what more do we need to know in order to help UKRI make those decisions in terms of what interventions can they do to look at research integrity. So during the course of that, we looked at, we did some surveys and workshops, which I'll talk a little bit more about, to gather more evidence, taken together with what came through from our review of the existing literature, to come up with a whole series of recommendations for UKRI to consider in terms of their actions around research integrity. So the project started in June 2019, a little bit held up by the recent COVID lockdowns, but we were able to publish that in just last month. So this is the project team that was involved in it. Myself and Kate were the lead researchers. Katie was the lead researchers on the project. Our co-partners were UK RIO, and James was very helpful in terms of helping us with a series of interviews of key stakeholders to get their views. Marcus Munafo, which we'll hear from later, who's presenting later, from the UK Reproducibility Network. Him and his team conducted the literature review that we did on the project, which has been published as a separate annex to the report, which I hope you'll find useful. We also had a team from CRAC, which is the overarching organisation for Vitae. Karen was very helpful in terms of running a series of workshops around the country. where we brought together researchers, people engaged in institutions on research integrity, in order to discuss some of the issues that are coming through from that research literature review. Excuse me. Robin and Miriam are part of the crack team that were involved in running the survey, in which we received over 1,000 responses to that, again from researchers at postdoctoral level, doctoral level, and from academics, including some research integrity officers as well within institutions. And then finally, Anne-Marie Coriat from the Wellcome Trust and Maura Hinsey from the Irish Health Research Board were our experts that joined us on our team as well. So in terms of the background to this report, we used the definition for research integrity that's within the Concordat to support the research integrity. This was the revision of that Concordat was happening alongside the review, but we were anticipating what was coming out in October 19 in terms of the defining of research integrity. So we were looking at what do people understand in terms of the honesty that's required within all aspects of research, the rigor within the methods and interpretation and communication of research, the transparency and open communication that's needed to ensure good research integrity, and that care and respect in terms of research participants or subjects, but also in the stewardship of research and scholarship. Now, all of these are virtues that we're looking for in terms of research integrity, but there's no absolute definitions of what they should be like. It's all a continuum, and it's actually very difficult to quantify exactly what good research integrity looks like. And that will differ by the context of it. So particular disciplines will have different criteria in terms of how research is conducted. And everybody's having to use a level of judgment in terms of what is their understanding of research integrity. We wanted to look at how well do people understand what research integrity looks at, but also what are the influences on them in terms of their personal behaviours, of all those incentives and drivers within the whole research ecosystem. And inevitably, it's a very complex environment we're talking about. So first of all, as I said, we looked at the literature review in terms of what do we already know about this. And to be honest, there's quite limited data in terms of levels of research integrity. It tends to focus more, the literature tends to focus more on extremes. So you can certainly find published papers about the frequencies of retractions, of reporting of misconduct cases. There is information that comes through from the quality assurance processes that UKRI do in terms of the institutions and organisations they give grants to. There's institutions' own publications of their annual reports against the Concordat, against the research integrity. But what is still very unclear is whether or not we are seeing increases level in terms of issues around research integrity. There's certainly increased interest on research integrity, but is that because we've got improved detection mechanisms, or is there more attention being paid to it, or is it just a great awareness of the importance of that? And I think that's one of the challenging things in terms of going forward is how do we, when will we know that we are continually achieving very high levels of research integrity? There's a lot of commentary in the literature also in terms of what's impacting on research integrity, particularly around as James was talking about, the research culture and how many career-related issues are impacting on people's behaviours. So the pressure to publish is one that's often cited in terms of impacting on researchers' behaviour.
Sorry everyone, we've got a problem with Janet's audio and video. As soon as we get that back, we'll be with you. Hopefully people can see and hear this. If not, that's a problem with everybody, but I can see Katie's now online, so perhaps she can take over until Janet rejoins us. Katie, would you like to continue?
Yes, absolutely. So forgive me, I'll just talk briefly about the next couple of slides in place of Janet. But I think what you heard Janet say before she cut out was around that complexity of the environment, and this is just an example of that level of complexity. So we've got a range of incentives here that we explored through the study, some of which were already provided by UKRI in what they would like us to explore, and many of them we added through the study in our engagements with workshop participants and with the interviews with stakeholder organisations, so that we could have a breadth of topics to talk around. And then just to further describe that complexity of the research ecosystem as we described it, this is a very simplified and pragmatic model of the research ecosystem that you can see going from the global level, and we affectionately referred to this as the onion of the research ecosystem, so the outer sphere of those global influences, things like the publishing environment, as Janet was talking about, the research funding environment potentially, going internationally. Elements of the research ecosystem that are very UK specific, and this report was particularly looking at the UK environment. So UKRI, for example, and Wellcome as UK level funders, but also those national agreements that we have, such as the Research Integrity Concordat, the Research Development Concordat, and the other series. And then the institutional level, and again, each of these levels are not one homogeneous thing. We've got different types of institutions, different levels of research intensity, different focus and strategies. And then the discipline, which again, as it's a pragmatic model, we've conceived that as sitting under an institution, which you might think of as the faculties and departments of the institution. But of course, there are you know, national and international discipline and subject associations that are also operating at different levels. And then those two inner layers are thinking about the local environment that an individual sits within. That might be their department, it might be their research group, or it might be you know, the colleagues that they're sitting close to in their department. And then, of course, individual researchers themselves, the people ultimately who are carrying out the research. So at this point, I'll pick up sort of building on that background to talk through a few of the findings from the study. It's tempting to want to tell you about everything, but I'll try and focus on a few things that, that we can potentially pick up and discuss, and things that potentially we can act on as a result of the study. So the first question is thinking about, what do researchers think about research integrity? So this is, these are some of the results from the survey of researchers and other individuals in the research system. And we asked them about a range of potential drivers of research integrity. And the donut that you can see there on the left, you can see that they overwhelmingly agreed that their own personal integrity was a driver for research integrity. So 99% of them, with the other 1% as don't know. So no one that we surveyed disagreed about the importance of personal integrity. And throughout the study, we saw that researchers have a very strong sense of personal responsibility for their own research integrity. So moving to the right, the vast majority also believe that they understand what's expected of them, which of course is important in being able to carry out research with appropriate levels of research integrity. And academic staff were slightly more likely to strongly agree than research staff or doctoral researchers that they have that strong understanding. So I think it's really important to note these positives, though as expected, the picture throughout was not entirely positive. So if we look at moving down to the bottom left, we can see the proportion of respondents who believe that research integrity is not always upheld at 90% there. And of that remaining 10%, only 7% of respondents thought that research integrity was upheld all of the time, and 3% didn't know. And interestingly, in this scenario, doctoral researchers were slightly more optimistic, with 11% of doctoral researchers thinking that research integrity is upheld all of the time, but also slightly less sure in that 7% said that they don't know. And then finally, on the bottom right, the majority of respondents believe that researchers feel tempted or under pressure to compromise on research integrity at least some of the time. So 78% of them. And a very similar proportion to previously, just 6% think that researchers never feel tempted. And a relatively large proportion of 16% say that they don't know. So although that researchers might be relatively confident in their own ability to conduct their research with high levels of integrity, many assume that there are general vulnerabilities and perceived pressures in the research system that, although they might not be falling foul of, there's a suspicion that others might be. So looking next at what some of those perceived pressures might be, as you saw earlier, we asked survey respondents about a whole range of incentives, and we used those incentives to ask respondents whether they think those incentives have a positive impact on research integrity, which is shown in the left-hand green column, a negative impact, and those are shown in the right-hand red column, or whether they're perceived as having both positive and negative impacts on research integrity, and those are shown in the middle column in amber. And as you can see from this overview, what comes out is a temptingly simple snapshot of incentives working either for or against research integrity. However, as with the structure of the research ecosystem, nothing is quite as straightforward as we might like it to be. So just to give you a flavour of the richness sitting behind this table, discussions with the workshop participants and the free text comments coming through from survey respondents illustrated many of the caveats and many of the assumptions behind these overall responses. So for example, research leadership and management appears as both a top positive and an incentive with a mixed impact. And here respondents were telling us of the strong influence of leaders who act as role models for research integrity and how that can be overwhelmingly positive, but that conversely, leaders can undermine research integrity. And that might be directly through bullying, for example, or it might be inadvertently through their own poor practice. And these effects of local culture were described as strong bonds that play out in the levels of research integrity locally that can be quite resistant to the weaker forces of things like top-down policies and procedures, either at an institutional or national level. And then looking particularly at those incentives perceived as having negative impacts, they were often described as things that didn't work well at the moment, but that they might have some potential to be positive drivers in the right circumstances. So, for example, using metrics in inappropriate ways can be the ultimate issue, rather than in principle the existence of metrics. And so some commented that metrics that align with research integrity and with a positive research culture could be a good thing. And this same principle applies to league tables and workload models and in the assessment of researchers. It's often about the detail of what is measured and how it's applied that has a negative impact. Though of course there were comments in favour of having no metrics or league tables or workload models at all. So I think it's worth noting that many of those incentives and potential pressures that we explored are not directly connected to research integrity itself necessarily. And I think this is partly due to the helpfully broad definition of research integrity in the Research Integrity Concordat. And so what we saw, and I think potentially aided by that broad concept, is that many of the things people were talking to us about were not specifically about research integrity, but tended to be about research culture more broadly. And there was a clear sense that the same pressures identified as being detrimental to research culture were also detrimental to research integrity. And that on the other side, improving research integrity and research culture could be mutually beneficial. So you can see here a few aspirations for a research culture that supports research integrity as they arose from the study, mapped against those virtues that we saw earlier from the Research Integrity Concordat. And just focusing specifically on the last two there, embedding a culture of continuous improvement and reducing the sense of competitive and career-related pressures. I think that we've all, I'm sure, noticed that improving research culture is increasingly embedded in our concept of the research ecosystem and our ambitions for research and development at a UK level. And those two in particular link through nicely to the principles of the Researcher Development Concordat. And I think all of those concordats collectively paint that picture of what we think our research culture should look like. And so for my final slide, I'd just like to take you through a few of the suggestions from the participants, respondents and interviewees of ways that research integrity could be improved. I think it's really, really important and positive that we've got a large audience today that spans many different roles and perspectives, because one of the overriding messages from the study is that research integrity is all of our responsibility, and there are all actions that we can all take. And so at the global level, there's potential for different stakeholder groups, so governments, funders, publishers, for example. They could look to each other to make the first move, but interviews with stakeholder organisations in particular were encouraging of that shared responsibility and of the collaborative actions that are needed. So although, as we've seen, researchers feel a high level of personal responsibility, what's clear is that research integrity doesn't only happen at the point of conducting the research. There are many points before and during and after the research life cycle that research integrity could be either supported or undermined. Then at the UK level, it's not, as Janet was talking about, and as James was also talking about in his introduction, it's not enough to look at just incidents of poor research integrity and focus on things such as avoiding fraud and serious misconduct. What's measured at the UK level should be informing and improving levels of research integrity, and also enabling issues to come to light and to be resolved, rather than, for example, pressure to hide those issues in order to, for example, rise up in the league tables. At the discipline level, one of the useful things that came out is ensuring that conversations about research integrity happen across discipline boundaries, and that we're not talking about rigour or any of the virtues in a binary sense, but as a shared understanding of good practice, and that sharing can usefully be informed by good practice in other disciplines. Then at the local level, for example, that embedding of a culture of continuous professional development and recognising and rewarding time for that engagement, which are all things coming through from the Researcher Development Recorder. And then finally, on the individual level, I hope you've seen that message coming throughout, which is that we all have the opportunity to contribute to that culture of continuous improvement and development. And that means for each of us, just by investing in our own knowledge and our own understanding of research integrity, and then endeavouring to carry that out to the best of our abilities, we're all doing a piece to improve research integrity and improve research culture overall. So thank you very much. Our contact details are here, and as James mentioned, we'll share the slides later, and I look forward to hearing your questions and discussing with you later.
Katie, thank you very much, and thank you also to Janet, who unfortunately had to drop out earlier due to some technical issues. I'll now hand over to our second speaker, Dr. Karen Salt, who's Deputy Director of Culture and Environment at UKRI and Deputy Chair of UKRI's External Advisory Group for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. Karen, the webinar is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings, everyone. Let me just pull this up and make this big. Great. So I am thankfully joined by some others who I will introduce in a few moments. But as the slide notes for all of you, I am Dr. Karen Salt. I'm a Deputy Director within UKRI of a policy area that we refer to, this is in what we call the Strategy Directorate. So this is an area that bridges across the sort of corporate hub, or the center and the hub of UKRI. And I work closely with our councils and our research centers and institutes, and all of our executive chairs, as well as our CEO. I'm part of the sort of executive senior management team within that space, And as the slide notes, my policy area is referred to as R&D, culture, and environment. And what's really great about this role, so I've come into this role after a period of secondment from the University of Nottingham, where I directed a research center called the Center for Research in Race and Rights. I've led a lot of research teams of multiple sizes, worked with community partners and governmental groups and various different institutions. So I'm really quite fascinated and interested as a researcher myself in information, in how do we present and prepare and gather the best information that we ultimately can, and how do we get that into the hands of as many people as we can so that they can ultimately benefit and participate in the knowledge production process. So I'm quite lucky to be in this role, because this is a role that I'll give you a bit more about so that you just sort of understand the teams that essentially report to me and what we're able to do within UKRI to really push at and understand research integrity and the way that it merges into and complements existing work within other areas. Today, you're going to hear from kind of three of us that are related to the research integrity work. Myself, Helen Mann, Dr. Helen Mann, who's also on the line, who will eventually be able to present a bit more to you for you about the Research Integrity Committee. We are very honored that Helen has recently joined us as our interim chair, getting us through the process of essentially strategically sort of obtaining some senior leadership and ultimately the development of the Research Integrity Committee, including some additional material that she will cover for you shortly. And then I'm extremely pleased to also have with us Rebecca Vetch, and Rebecca is our head of research integrity for UKRI, and will be able to join us to answer any questions that you might have, especially around the work that team is doing. So for those of you who are not completely aware of who and what UKRI is and what we do, because I recognize that we've got some folks on the line from multiple countries, and for some who really you only pay attention to UKRI in relationship to some bits of what it does. So we're a fairly young organization. I sometimes say we're either a belligerent teenager or a stubborn toddler. But we have a long legacy roots within the funding bodies, including something like the Medical Research Council, which is over 100 years old. But UKRI has been in existence for a few years now, and has as its mandate, as you can see from the slide, delivering economic impact, creating social and cultural impact, pushing the frontiers. These are all these big, lovely, big words. But there's some four kind of pillars of the organization that are really quite critical. One is, trying to creating and fostering a trusted and diverse system, leading and nurturing talent, really, and that's really quite important. And thinking quite carefully about the environment with which research and innovation takes place. So that's thinking about the kit, the objects, the buildings, the infrastructure, but also our collaborations and our interactions with others. These are quite important. We're the largest public funder of research and innovation, and we give out somewhere in the magnitude of about £7.5 billion a year. That includes working specifically with higher education institutions, which I know some of you on the line are a part of, but that also includes research organizations or research intensive organizations. That includes members of industry, and that includes a number of other different sorts of compositions, if you will. So we do much more than just fund those who work at universities. Now you've got some of that breakdown here on this slide. There are these 9 constitutive parts for UKRI. So that's the Science and Technology Facilities Council, the Biotech and Biological Sciences Research Council, NERC. I can go through the abbreviations if you'd like for some of these. But that's Natural Environment, Innovate UK, which is that sort of innovation and industry and business space, which includes SMEs, And then we have something like the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Economic and Social Research Council, Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, Research England, which many of you will be familiar with, including for those of you who are involved with the Research Excellence Framework, or ultimately with QR funding. And then, of course, the Medical Research Council. What's interesting about these bodies is not just their sort of remits and their compositions. Some of them give direct funding to fellows, to doctoral training partners, and what we call collaborative doctoral training centers for PhDs and postgraduate researchers. But some of them also fund directly what we call national capability spaces, or certain sets of infrastructure or kit that are essential for some aspect of research and innovation for the UK. And so that might involve folks who are off doing Antarctic survey work, all the way through to those who may be on ships, and then those who are working directly as facilities. So we've got about 5,500 members of direct employees engaged in research and innovation, which is quite exciting. So as a note here says, a cross-disciplinary organization. We work closely with research and innovation, as well as with different parts of government. There's a sizable mass, both in the organization as employees, but ultimately also with the groups that we cohere and bring together. And this also involves working closely internationally with other funders, some in direct partnerships, and others because of the global mobility of research and innovation, people who move in and move out of different sets of systems. And so we nurture and encourage the international interactions. This gives you just a little bit more about UKRI. This is coming from our strategic prospectus, which really sort of gets underneath a little bit more about the trusted diverse system, which talks about our mandate about equality, diversity, inclusion, some about the sort of pipeline of current and future talent. I'm not always the big fan of the word talent, but it is the community of people who we want to support and nourish, to be able to produce and to create new knowledge, old knowledge, and great ideas. But there's two more bits that are really quite pivotal in terms of that sort of core structure for UKRI. One is this question about kind of openness and transparency. And that's really moving at this notion of sort of accessibility and the cooperative nature that's embedded within research, and then thinking quite carefully about research culture, and promoting the highest standards of research collaboration and integrity. Now, this is really quite important, these sort of four blocks, if you will, because while that also is setting the sort of strategy for UKRI, or at least our prospectus at the time from May of 2018, it also sort of starts to communicate what the message would be if we start to look at ourselves as a steward of the system, and not just as a funder and a funding body, and think about what's our role together, collaboratively with others, to really embed and drive these sorts of transformations and these sets of changes. So as I mentioned, in my deputy director role, I have a number of teams that report to me, and each one of those teams has a head of teams. I've already mentioned Rebecca, who's on the call, who essentially heads up a team on research integrity. But we have other teams that are working on research culture. We have a team that's working on equality, diversity, inclusion, and that includes tackling bullying and harassment. And then we have another team that's working on open research. And what's really quite exciting to be able to share with all of you today about those four teams that report to me, and they are really well-resourced teams to be able to drive our ambitions and our vision sort of forward, is that we're able to also work collectively. So that we're not working in isolation and thinking that, oh, this is a research culture question, so it only sits with the research culture team, or this is a research integrity question, so it only sits with research integrity, or this is something that's around bullying, harassment, or open research. We really are understanding the ways these areas link up, and they link up with other sets of things. And you can actually see that in the study. So I'll spend a little bit of time linking some of those link ups in the study for you, so that you can see how some of these things come together. We spent a lot of time with our investment colleagues in the investment strategy side, We also spend a lot of time with other colleagues working on other sets of related topics. That includes those who are working on place, or what we call talent, and then those who are working on questions of preventing harm. And all of these play a role, and you can see them shining in relationship to the study itself. So on this slide, what we've done is just pulled out a little bit about the different sets of things that actually are cross-cutting themes across our areas, or the areas of my teams, and give you some sense of how they relate in relationship to the study itself. You've already heard from Janet and Katie mentioning about the critical importance of the local environment. We really understand that quite deeply across our teams, because we recognize that we can set policy at the sort of funder level, but ultimately we are also talking about the delivery of what might be happening wherever somebody might work or wherever they might be engaged in their research. And these levels or tiers, if you will, are quite important for us to keep track of and to work hand in hand with groups on the line, as well as with all of you, to really start to understand what are these amplification effects. How do we sort of push down sort of ideas, and how do we bring ideas that are coming from the bottom up and ultimately need to be ones that funders and government are challenged on. You can see the importance here of interdisciplinary research. Researchers and assessment criteria, including criteria around promotion, and obviously things like metrics and data sharing. These are things that motivate our teams. The teams are working on these across a whole range of other areas. And it was both shocking, heartening, and also, I think, motivating to see those picked back up in the study itself. And actually play a role around thinking about the incentives that might be motivating or encouraging or enabling the tensions or strains around research integrity. So this just gives you just a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that we're doing. We are tackling aspects of bullying, harassment. We are continuing to work and evolve, actually, equality impact statements. It's not enough to essentially just monitor and understand what the impacts are, but it is really quite critical to start mitigating and actually start to put in place reviewing and assessments of different sets of policy decisions. We're really quite keen on and have developed a research ethics hub. Some of that is related to COVID-19 research. But we're also trying to unpick this so that we can ultimately be a place that people can come to for a one-stop shop, if you will, around ethics. Obviously, many of you are aware of the concordats that UKRI have signed, whether or not that's DORA or others on research integrity, and many of you are involved in moving those forward. I'm sure that some of you have also been involved in our open access review, which is now closed, but ultimately we are assessing and evaluating that set of information in terms of our next set of policy making. And I'll just mention one other thing that is up on this about a funding call, a postgraduate research funding call that we're doing between Research England and Office for Students. That is on Black and minority ethnic postgraduates. And it's a pre-announcement on a catalyst fund for that. So while not all of these are directly related to every single bit of things that are mentioned in the study, we are essentially linking these up and working collaboratively across them as we start to think quite critically about research culture. So just a little bit, I know that there've been some questions that have been raised, and we've already kind of anticipated some of them, which is sort of, well, what's different now based on the preponderance of information that we've assembled across a range of different things. We're also in a very different climate and environment. As many of you know, the impacts of COVID-19 have been disproportionately felt by a number of different sets of people, not just those who've actually experienced the virus or who have had unfortunate deaths in their own families, but also those who have had their research or their, what might feel like even their careers immensely impacted, from furloughing to, we continuously hear about these questions of redundancy, and we're working really quite hand in hand with our communities and putting out a number of different sets of packages to address some of this. But you can see that sort of climate of tension and uncertainty and anxiety living on the back of these other sets of reports and documents that have already been put together, mean that we're in a kind of very different moment right now, where we need to start to sort of think about how do these sorts of our prior knowledge sort of flow into this particular moment, even though the study was concluded before some of the impacts of COVID-19 and we're a kind of pre-period, if you were. We can take a lot of the knowledge from this study into what might be our next set of kind of policy mitigations. So one of those is this link through, which we're thinking about, improvements in research culture. If we go back to 2014, we've got something like the Neufeld Council on Bioethics work, talking about research integrity, where we can now link that through all of these studies and understand something like NDA, investigations into alleged misconduct, these questions about bullying, and then these understandings about concern on compromised research integrity or the limited confidence in raising concerns. We can actually start to map out what may be these impacts over time of these sets of recommendations that may not have made changes, or ultimately policy not being in place that can help us drive or deal with some of these sets of challenges. I do have one more. I thought I had one more for you that was going to sort of pull some of these out, including picking up these questions of kind of workload and the workload pressures, and how that might be linking up with sort of systems and metrics and the drive out of creativity, and ultimately leading to the sort of negatives around bullying, harassment. Katie has already helpfully presented some of the information about the sort of negative impacts around bullying, harassment, journal impact factors, league tables, and workloads. But I thought I would take a moment and just raise for you the 5 positive impacts, the top 5. And I think these are quite fascinating for a person like me working in the area that I'm in. And those are things around data sharing, open access, interdisciplinary research and interaction, professional development, research leadership and management. And once you start thinking about what enhances research integrity, you can start to see that we can move well beyond just training and a question of promoting ethics. It may be something in the way that people might be doing their work, in the way that they're proliferating and sharing that work. That could be some of the ways that we should be adopting, some of the methods that we should be adopting going forward. And I just have a couple of last slides for you here. And we've got various different things in place. As I mentioned already, we've got things like DORA. Us within UKRI, we sign on to these various different concordats. We embrace them and promote them, and encourage others to essentially live by a number of the tenets within them. But we also think we need to do lots more. And some of that might be thinking about some of those sets of pressures and tensions around workload, or tensions around additional asks. So we've been piloting, for example, a resume for researchers style kind of CV format across the research councils. And we'll be reporting on that in due course about what something like that could mean. Ultimately, it's not the magic sort of resolution of workload, but we're really trying to reflect on the ways we may be contributing to increase workload and pressures on researchers. And there are a few other things that we're also trying to do ourselves, but ultimately want to challenge across the sector to do. And I mentioned already about signposting guidance and processes for ethics in relationship to COVID-19, but part of that is about the pace of research and the pace of research in this particular moment. And that's the broad sense. That's not just necessarily about biomedical research. That's also research that people might be doing with participants in communities and various other sets of things that are dealing with different sets of tension. So we've got to start thinking about how do we help and support while we're also trying to deal with an emergency situation, and what can we learn from that we might be able to pass on into other processes. And I would probably be remiss if I didn't mention a little bit more about the preventing harm and bullying harassment, given that the top 5 negative impacts was bullying and harassment, and the ways that may compromise research integrity. We have a preventing harm or a safeguarding policy which also encompasses bullying harassment. And we'll be engaging and moving forward our wider program on bullying harassment. Many of you may have seen our position statement prior, but we've also convened a funders forum, so we're working collaboratively with multiple funders, including the National Science Foundation in the States, to develop what we hope may be some policy alignment, but ultimately to do the sort of cross-sector work that is needed to prevent bullying harassment from even occurring. And this is just a final slide that just shows you about the preventing harm. Again, although this is not the focus of the Research and Integrity Committee, it's really quite critical for us to just note that we're trying to find the complementary areas that would ultimately support the work of the Research Integrity Committee, and ultimately can allow them to focus on the work that they have, and other teams will be bringing the other work forward. So I do want to thank you. And I will now pass on to Helen Mann, who will take us into a bit more about the Integrity Committee.
Hi. So thanks very much, Karen. I'm hoping that you can see my slides. So thanks, Karen. So my name's Helen Mann. I am very, very new to UKRI and the work of the Research Integrity Committee, just a few days in.
Sorry to interrupt. We can see your slides in presenter view. I don't know, so we'll be able to see your notes and everything. That was intentional.
No, not. I don't know how to get out of presenter view now. End slideshow.
I think it's display settings.
Yeah. If I go that, is that just going to go back in?
If you go to your slide.
Yes, sorry, forgive me. Yeah. Yeah.
We can still see present. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Apologies for that. So yes, Helen Mann. I am new to UK Research and Innovation and new to the work of the Research Integrity Committee. And really, these are just a few slides because, as you will see, we are certainly at the start of our journey in terms of setting up the Research Integrity Committee. And this is really a teaser for quite a widespread and deep consultation we want to have with the community over the course of 2020 as we look to set this up. So for those who don't know, I've spent 10 years as Executive Director of the Academy of Medical Sciences, which is a body that represents the whole of medical science in the UK, an elected fellowship of about 1,200 researchers. And that elected fellowship and the expertise we use to influence policy, to award grant funding, to mentor early career researchers, and of course to try and improve the research ecosystem and the research culture around UK medical research. So we spent a lot of time worrying about research integrity and how we can promote improvements therein. We led a report on research reproducibility, and Marcus was kindly involved in that. But also I think we really saw at the sharp end how research integrity issues matter so much to the translation of research into real world benefits, and actually everything that we do to promote research and robustness falls down if there are perceptions that it's not being developed within a high integrity environment. So this is an issue that's very important to me, and I'm very pleased to be involved in it. So I think we've heard already that there have been a number of reports that have led to this moment. And I think that's really to be welcomed in the sense that this is widely perceived to be a really important moment in time for us to now take on research integrity and try and make the step changes we need. And really it's been the Science and Technology Committee Inquiry Report of 2018 that's led the foundations for what UKRI and the Research Integrity Committee is trying to do. So these are the envisaged roles for the Research Integrity Committee as set out in the S&T Committee report. And they're twofold. So that the Integrity Committee would be a national voice. So it would be a champion for research integrity in the UK, engaging international communities to contribute to evidence bases, practices and standards, and that it would drive, but importantly not own, the implementation of the revised Concordat to support research integrity. And I think you can sort of see this building on what Karen said about UKRI, feeling that it has a role in terms of stewarding the research environment and also what we heard from the Vitae work about the committee being able, hopefully, to think about the sort of national level leadership, looking at systemic issues and highlighting how we can build that culture of continuous improvement at the national level. Its other role will be around review and assurance, again, independently examining whether and how research institutions have followed appropriate processes to investigate research misconduct. And at the moment, that is envisaged as research misconduct and not conduct around harassment or bullying. And it's also, at the moment, focusing on UK research institutions. Again, I'm sure we can discuss that in questions. So far, the work of the research integrity team within UKRI has been really hearing a lot from those in the community, and you can see some listed here. Also looking at interesting examples of similar committees in other constituencies, including Australia, Canada, USA, Finland, and others. But really, the main work is still to come. And that is for us to formulate and issue a consultation that will hopefully come out in the autumn to really understand the community's views on the parameters and focuses and priorities for this committee, and how we can set it up in a way that we feel we've all contributed to and is doing what we want it to do. At the same time, we will be going through an open recruitment for the committee chair and members to ensure that we have the right constituents to take the work forward. So again, it's important to add, to really emphasize that line at the top of this slide, that we really are looking, especially at the moment, given what we've said about COVID and the headwinds and challenges that are facing the research community, we are committed to establishing a committee that will add value and not burden to the community. We're setting it up as an arm's length body under UKRI. This is not something we've done before. It is breaking new ground, but I do believe that that's the appropriate constitution for it. And again, to emphasize that this really is the start of our engagement with this community, and it's great to have so many people on this webinar because this sort of engagement will be really key to making sure that we set up something that's both robust and proportionate. So you can see there what we're planning this summer, and then a public consultation will follow in the autumn. So I'll stop there and look forward to participating in questions.
Thank you, Helen. That was very informative, and we, UKRI, along with the rest of the research community, look forward to working with you to help set up the new organisation. We'll now hand over to our final speaker of the session, Marcus Munafo from the UK Reproducibility Network, who will talk about the work of his organisation, his and its involvement in this report, and the implications for research integrity. And then we'll finish it off with a panel discussion. Marcus, over to you.
Thanks, James. So, I'm at the wrong place in my slide. That's not a good start. So thanks for inviting me to speak today. So I'm speaking on behalf of the UK Reproducibility Network. I'm chair of the steering group, and what I'm going to do is briefly give an overview of my personal journey through these issues from early on in my career as a postdoctoral researcher to where we are now, and in particular, how that has shaped the design, if you like, and structure of the network that we've set up. So the first thing I want to say is that, as many of you will be aware, this is not a new issue. This is a survey from 2005, which spoke to the question of the integrity of science in this case, but we could extend that to research more broadly. And this quote, I think, is particularly important because it says that certain features of the working environment of science may have unexpected and potentially detrimental effects on the ethical dimensions of scientists' work. And I think part of what this quote is telling us is that, first of all, by ethical dimensions, we mean that in a broad sense. But secondly, perhaps more importantly, we need to remember that these impacts on the behavior of researchers will not necessarily be operating consciously. One of the things that I've brought to my own interest in this area as a psychologist is the fact that human behavior is shaped by a range of factors, many of which operate outside of consciousness. And we need to be aware of that, because that will then inform what we might want to do when it comes to shaping behavior positively. So the issue is perhaps that We have a method for doing research. This again focuses on the scientific method, but all disciplines have their own methods, and those methods have provided unparalleled insights. So we mustn't be too nihilistic about the state of research in the UK and globally, but that over time, you might argue that that approach to doing research has become distorted by the fact that we now live in a very different world to that which existed when many of those methods were developed, that science and research more generally has changed, the incentives have changed within academia and more broadly, and that has led to a distortion of the way in which we work, such that that which is good for researchers and their careers is not necessarily that which is good for research and the discipline within that which that research is being conducted. The other factor to bear in mind is that as researchers, however well trained we are also human, and as a result subject to a range of cognitive biases that shape how we see the world. This is a nice quote from Nicholas Taleb, which captures that. Scientists may be in the business of laughing at their predecessors, but owing to an array of human mental dispositions, few realize that someone will laugh at their beliefs in the disappointingly near future. So however well trained we are in our discipline, we also bring to our work our own perspectives, our own cognitive biases, our own enthusiasm for our work, our own excitement at the possibility of discovering something new or contributing to knowledge, and that can lead us astray. This is a nice example of that I use, which is a photograph of a geological feature on the surface of Mars taken by orbiting satellites at 3 different time points. The first photograph looked a bit like a face, and people took that as evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life, or some people did at least, except that that finding couldn't be reproduced. It was effectively a trick of the light, compounded by the fact that we have a tendency to see pattern in noise, and in particular, a tendency to see faces in things. So our cognitive biases can lead us astray very easily if we're not careful, even if we're well-intentioned, even if we're doing the best work that we can. And we need to be aware of that intersection of the human factors element of research and the extent to which that can lead us astray, compounded perhaps by the incentive structures that we work within, which again will shape our behavior. And both of those factors can operate, and probably most of the time do operate, outside of conscious awareness. So Helen briefly mentioned this paper that we wrote a few years ago, myself and colleagues who've been working on these issues for some time, on how to address some of the threats to the quality of the work that we produce, and in particular, the stakeholders within that broader ecosystem that we've also heard about that have a role to play here. Researchers themselves, but also institutions, funders, journals, all of which have a part to play in this, and all of whose activities need to be aligned and coordinated in order to be maximally effective. Because really what we're dealing with here is a complex systems problem, and tackling any one part of that system is unlikely to lead to substantial change. We need to understand the system as a whole, and then understand the points of entry into that, and which of these different elements of that system need to be acting on those points of entry. So that was the motivation for setting up the UK Reproducibility Network, with the aim of ensuring that the UK continues to lead the world in conducting and promoting rigorous research, with our aims being to understand the factors that contribute to that, to provide training and disseminate best practice, to support and test interventions, and to coordinate with the various stakeholders, the researchers themselves, the institutions, the funders, the publishers, the learned societies, and so on. And that coordination function, I think, is potentially the most important part of what we're trying to do. We've existed for a little over a year formally. We now have local networks made up of grassroots communities of researchers at around 45 different UK institutions. We have 15 UK institutions that have formally signed up to be members of the network and have created senior academic roles focused on research improvement. And we have an external stakeholder group made up of funders, publishers, learned societies, and other sectoral organizations, with about 35 of those now working with us collectively. And we're also speaking to researchers and funders in a number of other countries who are interested in setting up a similar structure modeled on that which we have. So we have the steering group that coordinates that activity with an administrator that supports us, and then these local networks at a range of institutions, many of which now have an institutional lead working in partnership with that local network lead. The local network leads are often, although not exclusively, earlier career researchers. And one of our principles is that at an institution where there's both a local lead and an institutional lead, those would work in partnership but independently, with each acting as the critical friend of the other, I think, and ensuring that the voice of the grassroots researchers is involved in the discussion at the institutional level and at the wider national level. So part of what we are trying to do is broker conversations both across local networks and institutions, but also between institutions, researchers, and the funders and the publishers and the other external stakeholders, to ensure that coordination of activity as much as possible. So we were established in March 2019, following an informal meeting that was held at the University of Bristol in September 2018. That informal meeting made it very clear that there was enormous appetite for some kind of structure like this that would help with that coordination function that I've mentioned. And we've now grown to have these 45 odd local networks spread across the UK. And in fact, we just have one now that's been set up in Northern Ireland as well, so that we have representation across all of the devolved nations. And we now have 15 institutional members. And what's interesting about this is that they range from the more research intensive to the more teaching intensive, from the larger to the smaller institutions. So there's quite a range that's represented. And of course, each of those institutions will have its own local culture or cultures, its own needs, and its own communities. So the structure allows for a great deal of flexibility in how the initiatives that we are engaged in are deployed and realized on the ground. A key aspect of what we try to do is that our work is peer-led. So the community of researchers that make up our local networks is very much part of how our activity is shaped. Our ethos is around working collaboratively to reform culture and practice, and we're striving for broad disciplinary representation. It's fair to say that the majority of our membership and effort at the moment is in the biomedical and life sciences space, but we're working very hard to reach out beyond that. I can speak to that in the Q&A if there's interest in that, because I think there are some very interesting questions around what constitutes best practice across different disciplines, and importantly, what we can learn from different disciplines that may have addressed some of these issues in some respects in ways that other disciplines may not be aware of. So the kinds of initiatives that we promote are listed on our website, and some of them are shown here. I just want to focus on one, reproducibility. This is one that I particularly like because it was initiated by early career researchers who at the time were PhD students at the University of Oxford. They've moved on, or two of the three that set this up have moved on since. Amy Orbans, Sam Parsons, and Sophia Krul created this concept. And we were able to support them in that to increase the reach and the visibility of this journal club format that is focused on discussing reproducibility issues whilst drinking tea, hence the name. We were able to send out starter packs to our local networks that comprised a teapot and some other materials, just to create a bit of energy and interest in the idea. And this has been a hugely successful initiative driven by the efforts of those early career researchers in a way that we've been able to support and amplify. So again, creating an opportunity for researchers themselves to shape the discussion and contribute to the efforts that we engage in. And it's worth noting one of the points that was touched on previously, which is that this interest in research culture and incentives obviously predates the ongoing COVID pandemic. But one of the things that we have seen as researchers have moved fast to create and obtain evidence around the emerging pandemic is exactly how these problematic incentives can play out. And we've seen that happen over a much shorter timescale than usual, with that pressure to produce evidence that can inform our response to the pandemic. So there is, if you like, a particular opportunity now to use the experience that we're going through to understand how these different incentives can lead to unhelpful output. We've already started to see, for example, retractions of major pieces of work that were published in high-profile outlets that that are perhaps shaped by the amplified incentives that we're experiencing at the moment. So that hopefully gives an overview of the work of the network, and I'll just end on a plug for a conference that will be hosted by the Wellcome Genome Campus in September this year, which will be an online campus, and if you're interested in the work that we're doing, much of that will be represented at that meeting. Thank you.
Marcus, thank you very much. Okay, so we're now entering the final segment of the webinar, which is we have from 45 minutes, because everyone's been very prompt with their timings. Thank you very much. As an organizer, this is a joy, for questions and discussion. As well as our speakers so far, we'll also be joined by Rebecca Bache, Head of Research Integrity at UKRI. Now, we've had a lot of questions come in, including some pre-submitted questions, and perhaps the panel might want to consider the pre-submitted questions first. And so we'll deal with those, then I'll go through the ones in the Q&A stream. Just a reminder, if you put a question in the chat box, we're less likely to see it. So if you can, attendees, if you can use the Q&A button to submit your questions there, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we asked for questions to be submitted in advance as well. We'll just deal with a couple of those, and then we'll deal with the live questions. Okay, the first question was from, I should say, some people were happy to be identified, others not, so we'll keep you anonymous if you want to be anonymous. Victoria Wilkins from NERC, part of UKRI, asked, how does this report relate to other studies and report by other authors in this area? And is there more details on the direction of further studies that might be done on these topics? I don't know if you'd like, perhaps someone from UKRI might like to comment on that, or perhaps Janet and Katie.
James, I'm happy to answer the first part of the question, in that in the literature review that we did, we took into account anything that had already been done in this area so that we weren't overlapping or repeating anything that had been done. In terms of our requirement for the study from UKRI, it was to hand over the conclusions that we came to UKRI for them to consider how they were going to take it forward from here. So I'll pass the baton on to somebody from UKRI.
I'm happy to come in at this point. Hopefully you can hear me now. As I think the presenters have discussed, there's a lot of research that led up to this point, and we are trying to pull it all together. So we do want to take all of it and use that to enable us to look at the next steps. And what we've been starting to see, looking at everything that has been done previously and from the landscape study, is there are some topics that are coming up again and again. And those are the ones that we are now looking to see if there's more work that we can and should be doing. But that's also, it's necessary for us to see who's working in the space as well, because we don't want to be duplicating work that other organizations like UKRI are doing, or the UK Reproducibility Network. So we're taking a step back so that we can tell what those are. But right now, the three areas that have been coming up again and again are around employment, around data science and statistics, and around the role of funders.
Thank you, that's really helpful. There were some questions about the forthcoming Research Integrity Committee, but I think Helen answered those in her presentation. So we had a question from Dr. Natasha Krisnick, who's a Research Integrity Officer at Birmingham City University, who felt the report was very insightful and interesting, but one thing that struck her was the reported lack of engagement from those working in the arts and humanities, and to a less extent the social sciences, compared to disciplines more closely aligned with medicine. And she felt that the report might inadvertently reinforce a particular way of understanding research integrity and research culture, which is so heavily linked to so-called hard science disciplines, possibly because related to the historical development of research ethics in those areas, and basically just wondered how can we all move forward in terms of engaging with those working in the arts and humanities to ensure their views and perspectives are incorporated into reports, strategies and guidance on research integrity. I think that's really a question for everybody, but perhaps Marcus, because I know that UKRN is trying to do more about reproducibility beyond the hard sciences, your views might be of interest, and of course UKRI, because this ties into your broad strategies. So perhaps Marcus first.
I'm happy to start on that, and then I'm sure others will have something to say. We are working very hard to reach out beyond that kind of core biomedical and life sciences space where I think most of the recent discussion has happened, but that's not to say that there aren't important conversations to be had in other disciplines. So for example, the Arts and Humanities Research Council is one of our external stakeholders, and we are having discussions with them around what the issues are in different disciplines, and for example, to what extent one might expect a historian using the same source materials, using a similar approach to come up with similar or different conclusions to another historian, say. So I think there are very interesting questions around what we would expect across different disciplines when it comes to things like reproducibility and research quality. And I think it's also worth remembering that many of those other disciplines will have a lot to say around the questions of research culture and researcher behavior and the extent to which we bring our own perspectives to the work that we do without necessarily realizing it. I think one of the limitations of quantitative disciplines is that it's easy to pretend, if you like, that because we use numbers, we're being very objective and impartial, whereas in many other disciplines, there's more of a tendency to embrace the fact that how we work is inherently subjective and then to tackle that head on, if you like. And perhaps we need a bit more of that in the quantitative discipline. So I think there are some very interesting conversations to be had and ideas that can be fed across from one discipline to another. And that's part of the wider conversation that I think is only just beginning, and that hopefully reports like this will help to foster.
Thank you. Would anyone from UKRI like to comment on this? And perhaps Katie and Janet, as people who led on the report, your perspectives could be useful as well about that engagement.
I mean, I guess I'll add in the sense that the work that I was presenting on and talking about across teams is discipline agnostic to a certain extent. It's not as if some of that is designed for just the physicists, or this group is just designed for the anthropologists or those who might be involved in that kind of ethnographic field work. I think there's some specific sets of challenges for some because of the environment with which they do their work, including those who might not actually do their research work at a university at all. They might have to spend their time on site someplace else, whether or not they're isolated or they are working with one or two people. Archaeologists would be one of those areas, or ecologists, for example. So I think there's some particulars about work and about research and about the types of information people have, and then thinking about safeguarding and shoring up the integrity of that work. And these processes that we need to be thinking about in the widest sense possible. The more we reduce it to, and not to quibble with Marcus, but the more we reduce it to a qual-quant battle line, we lose sight of the fact that this is integral to just producing knowledge and information and sharing it. And ultimately, we need to be figuring out what are the mechanisms we put in place to make that really hard for folks to do, and what are the things that we might be doing that might be hampering our ability to actually have really rich cross-disciplinary conversations, because we may all have the same purpose for doing our work, we just may do it differently.
Thank you. Janet or Katie, would you like to comment on this as well? Sorry, you're muted.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, all good.
So just picking up on Karen said, I think it is about the conversations. I mean, we worked hard to draw in the arts and humanities and social sciences into the workshops that we had to make sure that they were well represented. And I think it's the conversation about research integrity is happening less often than it is in terms of the more hard sciences, the more quant sciences. And I think that the disciplinary professions, the professional bodies, have got a role to play there in terms of encouraging those conversations, because research integrity applies irrespective of the discipline, but how it's expressed and the context makes all the difference. So it's encouraging each of the disciplines to have those conversations with themselves and with other disciplines so that they're sharing experiences. And many of the arts humanities who attended the workshops had found the whole discussion quite fascinating and something they hadn't reflected on before. So I think the interest is there. It's about having those platforms for the discussions.
No, I'm using. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Katie, did you want to comment at all?
No, I think that's fine.
Thank you. Now, I've just added a bit of my own. I mean, I'm an archaeologist and my background's there, so I sit within the arts humanities, but sometimes seen quite a sciencey arts humanities. I often found lots of the conversations about research integrity, they all resonate in some ways. There's some less clearly than others. I think reaching out to those disciplines who perhaps feel that they aren't included in those conversations is very important. And we also think about the language we use. If we communicate issues of research integrity and good practice in the model of, you know, you do a study that will be published in a peer-reviewed journal, that will often rule out certain disciplines who do research in a very, very different way, especially as you move to, say, the creative arts, where the output might not be a paper, it could be a thing, an artwork or a performance. And I think it's very important to have those conversations to find out what is relevant and what isn't to people in those disciplines. And blowing UKRI's own trumpet for a bit, we're about to start a piece of work where we look into that. So if you're in the arts and humanities and interested in issues of research integrity or good research practice, which is pretty much the same thing, but I think good research practice is perhaps a more accessible term, there's a contact form on our website. Get in touch with us because we'd like to find out who's interested in this issue so we can reach out to you. Thank you very much for that. Okay, we'll move into some of the questions in the stream now. The first question put almost 2 hours ago, Maurice Hoffman asked, would you agree that good patient and public involvement as part of research studies helps ensure research integrity and transparency? I mean, I think that's a question that anyone might wish to answer. Anyone want to come in on that?
I'll come in very briefly. I think that we would agree that openness engagement obviously improve research quality, and that it's very important that there's scrutiny, there's openness, bearing in mind whatever confidentiality that needs to be in place.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else want to come in on that? Okay, brilliant. A question came into how do we, which I thought was an interesting one, how do you account for misconceptions in research integrity? If you don't understand it, you might falsely think you are meeting expected levels of integrity. So perhaps that is the question of, you know, are we teaching researchers what they need to know about good research practice standards and the support available for them in meeting it? And if we're not teaching them, are they picking up good and leaving to sort of pick them up as they go along? Are they picking up good habits or bad? Anyone want to come on? Katie, yes.
I think it's a really important question, and as we've seen, the levels of respondents' belief in their own understanding is relatively high, perhaps as high as to be overconfident. And I think, you know, it's important to remember that people sometimes don't know what they don't know. So just raising that awareness of their own unknowing of those issues is really important. But just to weave a positive thread through that, one of the things that we saw through the workshops is that there is a very high level of understanding and a very rich and contextualized understanding of the issues that they're grappling with. Researchers in their daily conduct of research, with the caveat that those are, of course, the interested people who come along to workshops. So I think building on those positives and having ways of, you know, those people who are engaging with the conversation and doing good practice, finding ways for them that good practice to be seen and heard is really important.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to come in on that one? Marcus?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I think first of all, it's worth, I think, having as a guiding principle the idea that really the vast majority of people are doing the best that they can, if you like, but they maybe lack the skills, lack the awareness to do better. The awareness problem is an interesting one because it's a bit like driving. You know, the vast majority of people would say that they're a better than average driver. Very few people describe themselves as a bad driver. And I think the same sort of thing might apply here. So really what we need to do is just build this in right from the ground up. You know, we need to be thinking about this kind of training being part of undergraduate programs, and discussion of these issues happening from the point of entry into academia, which is as a first-year undergraduate, so that it becomes part of the wallpaper, if you like, from the ground up.
If I could just add one thing to that, James. I mean, I'm not in any disagreement, I think, with Marcus's take, but I was definitely struck in the study by a point I think Katie or Jen has already presented, those who believe that others are tempted. So it's actually quite fascinating that, and this isn't to necessarily, again, quibble with any particular point anyone has raised, but if we invest so much energy into thinking about the singular one individual in terms of their own training or what they might, we're losing sight that others are doubting other people are able to not be tempted or pressured. So something is going on with the cohort groups, right? Or with the people in departments, or those who are in an institute or in a center or wherever they're working, where they may have their own strength and positive to say about their own work, but they do not believe that everybody else is able to work in that same manner. So something is going on with either the trust or the belief or people's perceptions of how other people are feeling with the pressures, or whatever it might be, that we need to start to understand, because I think these relationships become quite important, or these perceptions are going to be quite interesting. And if we only do the trainings on the singular person, I think we're going to lose sight of what might be going on about what that finding is suggesting. And it's pretty high at 78%. So there's definitely something there to start to interrogate.
No, I think that's a very good point. When I saw that, I was reminded of a study, a meta-analysis on incidences of research fraud and questionable practices from about 10 years ago, where when asking people to admit what they'd actually done, about a third of respondents said, I've engaged in questionable research practices. When asking what they thought, emphasis thought, colleagues had done, they estimated that they were thinking about 3/4 of their colleagues were equally questionable practitioners. Now, of course, that may not be accurate, but as you say, the perception is really important. And that's a perception that's worrying, whether you're in a discipline where everyone works in close-knit teams or everyone tends to work on their own. There's still that collegiality and trust that matters. Thank you. Okay, a different question. Catherine Dean asks, and this is perhaps a question for UKRI, but also perhaps Vitae as well. Are there any plans to examine how to enhance research culture and hence integrity with a focus on disability access? Disabled researchers are more likely to be bullied, to have to do additional work, filling applications for accommodations, doing work to enhance the accessibility of institutions, so on, to be barred from accessing buildings equipment, to be assessed as shirking if they want to work flexibly. There's very little on pressure on institutions or funded to improve this situation, even in the basics of accessible buildings and research facilities. So would anyone like to comment on that issue?
I could cover just a little bit of this and give kind of 2 points. One is UKRI submitted evidence to the Women and Equalities Committee's recent call for evidence on unequal impact. So they were trying to understand the impact of COVID-19 on those with protected characteristics. And in there, we actually wrote quite a bit about those colleagues who are experiencing or have a declared disability, and the various ways that they are trying to navigate the terrain. Now, that doesn't answer the questioner for everything, but it does give us, we were pulling intelligence from multiple spaces, including our councils and other stakeholders, with which we could try to create a portrait moving forward. From UKRI's perspective, though, around disability, there's a need, we believe, to actually gather people together, some from, let's say, something like the National Staff Disability Network and other spaces, who can help us start to think about policy implementations across the main. So not just us as a funder, but actually the R&D sector more broadly, and understand the sort of assessments and the types of impacts and the mitigation that might be needed. So I'm not going to announce what that might be, other than to make it clear that this is something that we're actively developing, and to watch this space, because this is something we know ultimately needs to be done in the right way, so that we can all see the culture change that we want to see, as opposed to passing on responsibility to another entity to try to pick up, often including the colleague to have to do themselves, and that's not what we want.
Thank you very much. I don't know, does anyone else want to comment on that issue? Okay, Holly Anderson asked a number of questions, and pointing out that pressures in the system can particularly manifest themselves on students, and often, and even more so, on international students or women students, and particularly in terms of bullying and harassment. And so both pressures within the research system, but pressures within academia more generally, can impact most severely on students. I wondered if you had any comments on that issue. Perhaps Karen you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, I can talk about. I mean, I don't have the stats of who's been the most impacted in relationship to some of this. To sort of back up the questioner, or even to refute it, but I can show you how murky it can be. So we've commissioned a number of evidence reviews that came out. I think. Years, I don't understand years. I think it's 2020, but it could be 2025. But it feels like it was 1,000 years ago, but I'm sure it was only a year and a bit. But we did one on bullying harassment, and what was really quite fascinating, and these were looking at interventions primarily. We're trying to understand the scale of the problem. We were trying to figure out what was working to solve stuff. And in one of the pieces that was on bullying harassment, we were finding that people were actually being experiencing bullying harassment primarily in instances around. Sorry, let me rephrase that. That there were instances of bullying harassment for those who were trying to get access to things, and they were either trying to get access to labs, sometimes to kits, sometimes to conferences, sometimes to influencers, and sometimes to even data. So they were having to experience harassment in order to actually get that access, right? And to be able to do that set of work. And that's a very different way for us to start thinking about bullying harassment, and to start to think about how might professional status and various things that we would assume would be normal training mechanisms be part of this process of how harassment could ultimately work. And this type of gatekeeping. And yeah, Helen, that was exactly our face looking at that, because it suddenly meant we needed to start to understand how pressures might be placed on different people depending upon the power structures, and how that might manifest, not necessarily just in terms of research being not fully research misconduct, but essentially integrity issues, but the whole gamut. From ultimately getting access to material and information, possibility of information going out that could be questionable. So it now has meant we think we need to be a bit more sophisticated in the ways we're starting to ask and think about the questions of both research integrity, as well as these questions of bullying harassment, and recognizing the ways that they might bleed into each other in ways that will take some time to disentangle.
Sorry, muted. Thank you, Karen. That's very interesting. Janet, you wanted to come in. Sorry, Janet, you're muted.
These questions go to the heart of the quality, diversity and inclusion agenda. I think it's beyond research integrity and goes into research culture. It's about how do we create that level playing field for people so that, they're not disadvantaged compared to other researchers in terms of their ability to conduct research and to access the services that they need. And this is very much embedded in the Concordat, the Researcher Development Concordat. That whole issue in terms of research culture is about providing equality of opportunity for everybody. And I think there's, as Karen was saying, there's a massive job to be done here. In terms of changing that environment such that, people that do come in as researchers with disabilities or have caring responsibilities or even women still. We have an issue around how do we ensure that women have equal opportunities to men, that the research culture that we're working within can give those opportunities to people, to individuals.
Thank you. Janet, did anyone else want to come in on that one? Okay, another question then. I think this is mainly directed at Vitae. Anonymous attendee said, Katie gave examples of how research culture influences research integrity in her penultimate slide. This included 4 of the 5 core elements of research integrity, but not accountability. I also noted that accountability didn't feature in table 2 of the report. Is it that accountability doesn't fit into the narrative of this report, or if it does fit in, what role does accountability play? Now, I think that may be due to the fact that Concordat was being revised while the report was going on. But Katie, obviously, you're the expert, so let's hear from you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, it's I think throughout the slides, I probably referred to responsibility quite a few times. And of course, responsibility and accountability are not equivalent. But I think it's a fair question that accountability is certainly a feature, and I think you're right, James, in that perhaps that didn't come through as strongly in the previous iteration of the Concordat that started those conversations, but it's also not, I think, something that strongly emerged as a theme from participants and the survey respondents. But I think it's potentially, as I've done myself, that it almost has gone without saying, when of course it shouldn't.
Can I just add to that, because the Concordat did come out when we were mostly through the whole project, the revised Concordat, and we did actually go back and look at it because accountability was added as the 5th dimension of research integrity. But if you look to see how it's talked about within the research integrity Concordat, it's very much about institutions being accountable in terms of their actions around research integrity. So it was less applicable to what we were doing in terms of our project. So yes, we should have probably acknowledged that it was an addition to it, but I think Katie's comment about it's about responsibility, individual responsibility and organizational responsibility does come through as a theme in the report.
Thank you very much. Another question going back to there's Karen's slide, highlighting her slides, the wide range of concordats and initiatives affecting integrity. Is there a risk that these will be overwhelming for researchers and institutions, and so will be adopted in name only? And we also had another question, as researcher training and development is highlighted as a core element of the research integrity concordat, does that mean we don't need the concordat for researcher development anymore? I should say that I think the sector does recognise that concordat fatigue, to give it a term, is a thing, and that there's a danger of confusion between different concordats and different organisations working in this area. I think also what you don't want institutions to think that they have to engage in quick wins and say, okay, the concordat for research integrity has been made a requirement by HEFCE, which happened in 2014, and there's evidence from an interim report by UK in 2016 that organisations felt pressured internally to demonstrate to their governing bodies that they were suddenly in compliance with this HEFCE adopted initiative. So I think it's important to encourage organisations to really think about what these different initiatives mean, how to engage, and also look at how they overlap and effectively how you can implement multiple initiatives through single sets of actions where possible. And that's one reason why UK RIO works with other organisations on related interests. We're not just about research integrity, because we realise that it's part of a wider landscape of initiatives, which is why we're hosting this webinar. But Marcus, I know you wanted to come in, but as Karen, as the question was about your slides, I think it's only fair that you get the first response.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would probably +1 quite a bit of that, James. And I, for me, I think it's very easy to forget sometimes the political environments, the purposes for why some of these groups come together, the initiatives, the sets of things and the challenges, and the transformation that can ultimately happen by actually even producing a concordat. I mean, that's really brilliant. But then there's a really hard part, which is how in the world do you implement any of the stuff that's in it? And what does that ultimately look like? And who bears the brunt of the responsibility for that? And how do you monitor that? And what does that look like? And so it's not necessarily that I would warn the sector against making a concordat. It would mostly be to maybe pause for about 2 seconds to actually start to visualize the concordat being in existence and actually thinking, who's going to do this work? Who's going to be the driving force of this? And is this actually just requiring more burden for people, or more forms of assurance, or more various sets of things that isn't really driving at the issue? So we've been quite fortunate within UKRI, as I mentioned, because of the nature of the way a number of our teams are set up, is that we can have these cross-concordat conversations. We can talk about ultimately who's picking up workload around certain sets of things, and we can blend things so that ultimately we can see where some of them are actually talking to each other, but they were designed at different time periods, right? To work on different sets of issues. But if you're looking at the implementation of them, you actually could have one mechanism in the place of implementation that could cover a wide set of things. Now, I don't know how all of our different groups who are on the call are set up, but it would be good working in certain spheres or in certain areas to probably think about some of these that they are committed to and that they want to ultimately pull in, and think, how do these ultimately work together actually to bring about the culture change that we want, really, as opposed to just how do you fulfill the obligations of a concordat. Because at the soul of most of these concordats is transformation. And that, I think, is really worth the organization spending some time with, is sort of how do you fold that into the ethos of who you are? Because if you think you just solve most of these concordats by putting together a training course or two, I don't think you're getting at the spirit of what most of the concordats are trying to do, no matter which ones they're involved in. But I do, so a two-pronged. One is maybe slow down on the concordat creation, and think a little bit about the implementation part, and then what do we need to do to actually start to embed some of the spirit of some of these concordats into the practice of what we ultimately do, and doing it together collaboratively across the sector.
Thank you. I think that point about the spirit of it is very important. We get a lot of calls at UKRI, can you help us comply with the Concordat? And we say, and we basically ban that talk, because if you're just trying to comply, that's just doing the letter of it. It's about actually doing something with this and making some changes. Marcus, you wanted to come in on this.
Just really to build on those points, I mean, I think, you know, we recognise that researchers and institutions are having more and more asked of them, and the consequence can be, if we're not careful, that the institution develops a statement, puts it on their website, and feels like that's then that job done. And so one of the things that we're trying to do within UKRN is coordinate that activity, because actually what tends to happen is that every university puts together a statement on responsible research evaluation, for example, and they all put in a great deal of effort, and they all end up looking more or less identical. And all of that time and effort means that there's no bandwidth left to actually then do the real work of making sure that happens on the ground. So by working collaboratively across institutions so that we share statements, share action plans, share best practice, it reduces the amount of effort that's required to get to that point, and hopefully means that there's more capacity then to start thinking about how do we build this in, how do we incentivize it, how do we ensure that promotion criteria, for example, reflect what we are trying to reward and recognize in researchers themselves? How do we ensure that the researchers have a voice in that conversation so that those processes are fit for purpose, if you like? And that's a good example of how we need to do more than just the easy win, as you described it, and think about the totality of what we want to achieve, and also ensure that this happens across institutions, because if you do that at one institution and incentivize open research and data sharing and whatever it might be that you're focusing on at that point, and your researchers within your institution start working towards those new and arguably more positive incentives, if other institutions aren't doing the same thing, then that will, in the long term, be at a cost to them if they then move to another institution which is rewarding different things. So this is a collective problem, and we need to be working collaboratively to address it.
Right, so very helpful. Katie, sorry, please do come in.
Thank you. I just wanted to take the opportunity to go back to that specific question. I think, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Karen and Marcus have said about you know, the need to ensure that these agreements are implementable and that the burden isn't too high. But just in defence, I suppose, of the Researcher Development Concordat, that original question, is it really needed if the Research Integrity Concordat picks up that element of training and support? And I just wanted to make the point that the Researcher Development Concordat is addressing its own particular aspect of research culture, looking at the environment and culture that particularly early career researchers are working in, but all researchers are working in, and about some of the challenges that we know around the employment conditions for those researchers, as well as the importance of their broad professional and career development beyond just research integrity, the whole range of that. So I guess just maybe to echo some of what Karen and Marcus were saying, in a perfect world, and there might be layers of perfection, we wouldn't need any concordats at all because everything would work perfectly. Maybe in 10 years' time, we'll come to the point where one concordat to solve all problems will be sufficient. But I think given where we started from or where we were 10 years ago, I think that there's a valid reason for having multiple concordats which are driven by different groups externally who are expert in the particular issues. And I think it's relatively recently that we've started to see how those concordats are starting to overlap, having come from different places. So I think that's a positive move to see where they overlap, but that they are still addressing distinct problems.
Thank you. I should say, if someone helped write both editions of the Research Integrity Concordat, and therefore I'm presumably a bit biased in its favour, I still think there's very much a need for the Research Development Concordat because it goes into detail about a related but very separate topic. I think there's a lot of interplay between the two of them, so there's a danger of duplication of effort, but equally opportunities to help implement elements of both by confined work. Okay, so a couple more comments. We'll go to one of the questions that was submitted in advance. This is in relation to find that local research culture is more important than institutional level initiatives. What can institutions do about that? The issue being that the people who are motivated to do this well are already doing it well, but those who don't like to are likely to be tough nuts to crack. What would institutional best practice look like to get near to 100%, and they say integrity positive, local research cultures? I think that's a question for everybody. So who would like to come in first? Katie, well, let's start with you again.
I just thought it was really interesting, the focus on those tough nuts. And I think perhaps that is maybe one of the most challenging issues in all of this. There will be a certain, probably small percentage of people who are very resistant to change and are, you know, stuck in the ways of bad practice. And so I think, you know, one of the things that's come from the report is that idea of focusing on a culture of continuous improvement. And, you know, we're not talking here about bringing people up to minimum standards. We're talking about, you know, what is the best research culture and research integrity that we can have. So I suppose thinking about shifting the whole research population and research system in a positive way might bring up that loose tail. So if we focus on, you know, where research integrity can be its best and lift the whole average, that might be an easier place to start than focusing in on people who are resistant to change. Yeah, that's just my thoughts on it.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come on this? Janet?
One of the things that came through quite strongly in the workshops was talking at the early career researcher stage, so particularly at postdoctoral level, who are much more mobile than other academic layers, about the different experiences they've had moving from research group to research group in different institutions or different countries, and how different the research integrity practice was within that. And I think that's one of the things we need to do, is about how do you reveal different practices that's going on within the same discipline area, but in different places. And so it may not just be that we've got tough nuts. we may have people who are not aware that there's better practice going on in different areas, and it's like, how do we share that experiences? And I was thinking through those workshop conversations, is that we have a community that have a level of knowledge that may not be, that may be better than other people's knowledge because they are so mobile. And it's about how do we draw out their experiences and give them a safe space to talk about those differences so that those discussions are being had.
If I could add to that, James, I guess I think the questioner, and I think and I agree with the question about the local environment, but I do think there's if we add local environment to workload pressure, or if we add local environment to assessment criteria, you start to see a different orientation to what that question would be, because actually what we start to see is reinforcement of certain sets of practices, even if they're informal. So it's your local space, but it actually is a sector-wide set of challenges, and a sector-wide set of manifestations. So I'm not denying Katie and Janet's and others' work around the importance of local environment. I think there's just when you filter that local environment through other sets of lenses, and I think you start to see maybe how the local environment might replicate or manifest that. But you can also start to see that it's not necessarily tough nuts per se, as it is informal practice that is consistently practiced in a particular way by particular sets of people. And as you move around, you see it in much the same way as people are responding to different sets of pressures. So I think there's something to start to unpack around that local environment question. And for me, one of the key ones would be informal sets of things, and not necessarily the more formalized ones. And how does that informal process, whether or not they're communicated that this is the way it's done, and this is the way it's always done, but you can't find a policy to back that up anywhere. It's that kind of stuff that we're going to probably need to spend some time with, because because those are forms of training. They're just done in an informal way. And they exist in part of the system, but we don't track them or map them in any way. We map the ones that are the formal ones that we set up, but we don't actually map what the informal system ultimately looks like, because it's playing a massive role.
And I'd say the informal is the dominant.
Sorry, I just realised Rebecca had put her hand up before any of us, so I think we should let her come in. Then Janet, then Marcus.
Thank you, James. All I wanted to add was that I think it's a really interesting discussion to have about recognition, both informally and formally, and what that looks like at both the very local level, who you specifically are working with within your discipline, at the institution level, and then across disciplines. There's a lot of work that we could look at, what's being promoted and what's being recognised.
Thank you. Janet, then Marcus.
Now, mine was just a comment to Karen's, that I think the informal mechanisms of learning about research integrity are far outweigh the formal mechanisms.
I think you're absolutely right. It was when learning about research is a matter of almost to pick up customs and traditions. And if you ask people, why do we do these things in this way? They themselves, the people telling you to do things in a certain way, may go, actually, I'm not quite sure. It's just the way it's done. I mean, that describes much of my research career. Marcus.
I mean, I'm not sure I have that much more to add, except, it's worth recognizing that we're not talking about a single culture here. There are many cultures across disciplines, across institutions, within institutions. And we need to recognize that, but also I think, going back to my earlier point, try to create commonalities in the way that we work across those, so that when we're talking about researchers who are mobile across institutions, particularly early career researchers, but at all career stages, they can move more seamlessly from one environment to another and not have to relearn how everything is done locally on the ground. There'll always be a degree to which that is the case, but if we can minimize that by having at some level a common approach to these issues, then I think that would increase the efficiency of the whole system, and also make life a lot easier for those researchers.
Thank you. Now, time has been getting away from us. It's almost 4 p.m, so it's about time to close. Now, to those who are attending, I recognise there are lots of questions we haven't been able to fit in. So what we'll do is we'll pull together the Q&A stream, we'll anonymise it, and we will put it to the speakers afterwards and see if they, and we'll also look at common themes and see if there are ways of answering your questions through other means, and then we can follow that with either sort of a round robin email to everyone who attended and or something on the UKRI website. There are also questions about if people have ideas to support ongoing or new initiatives, where can they put them? And now some of those things, the things proposed fall outside of UKRI's remit, but there's a contact form on our website. Use that, reach out to us, and we'll see if we can find people that you can talk to. So I think this has been a really, really productive session. Thank you so much to everyone for participating. We will have to close it now. It's getting near 4 p.m. and the panelists have been sitting in their chairs for 2 hours and their legs will be going numb. But hi there, good to meet you. Marcus wins the school webinar. I've had to rather open the door for delivery, so maybe I do as well. But anyway, thank you so much. We've had not quite the 500 who registered, a huge amount of really interactive, interested participants, so thank you so much for that. We will find a way to answer your questions. I'm just going to end by saying on Wednesday the 5th of August from 10 till 12, so in the morning, is the next UKRI webinar, which will be on research ethics, talking about practices for research ethics committees, but also for researchers as a whole, and drawing on some of the guidance we published in this area. So that will open for bookings soon. I do hope you can come and join us. But just to close off, thank you so much for our wonderful panelists, our very attentive and switched on audience. We will find a way to follow up on the questions we've been able to answer, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Everyone. Okay, so I'm never quite sure how to close online events, because normally if it's a conference, you turn the lights up and say the coffee's that way. So go enjoy your tea, coffee and cake. I hope you have someone standing by, and I'll close the webinar shortly. Thank you so much again. Bye-bye, everyone.